You got to take care of people, right? I think that's a big thing. You got to make sure that, it depends what the circumstances are for the acquisition. But I think first and foremost, am I taking care of my folks, right? Are they going to, when they leave and they're done, are they going to be like, Emiliano was a jerk. He screwed me over, right? Or like, look, we did the best with what we had and I landed somewhere and then we kind of went from there and I did X, Y, Z, right? And again, I don't know. Maybe I'm stupid, right? I'm trying to be maybe I'm too nice or I'm being naive or, I'm trying to make sure that the folks are being taken care of and the team is good because the world is small. It's a small
very,
world,
very small world,
right? Especially in tech. Like, I think people don't realize that. That's a big thing. Like, don't burn bridges. Don't be that jerk because, with LinkedIn, everybody knows somebody that knows that person.
It's true.
Everybody's back channeling, everyone's asking. So I want people to say, that I treated them right.
Welcome to Tech Careers and Money Talk. I'm your host, Christopher Nelson. I've been in the tech industry for 20 plus years. And after climbing my way to the C-suite, working for 3 companies that have been through IPO and investing my way to financial independence, I'm here to share with you everything that I've learned and also introduce you to people that can help you along the way. Today, I'm excited to introduce you to my good friend, Emiliano Berenbaum. Emiliano is a founder of 2 different companies, one that he sold for acquisition and the other one that he's scaling today. It's important that when we trade our time and talent for equity, sometimes we're doing that as a W-2 employee working for another large corporation, or sometime we're building. I really want to dig into Emiliano's story today of how he took his career from an engineer to an architect and then to a founder and CEO. What were the things that he had to learn? What were the skills that he had to build? In addition to that, we're going to spend the second half of the show really digging into what is building a software company for acquisition. What does that look like? He's done it already. He may be doing it again, but he has a lot of insight and lessons learned from having been there and done that. I'm excited to share that with you today. Let's go talk to Emiliano right now. Okay, welcome to this episode of Tech Careers and Money Talk. Excited to introduce everyone to my friend, Emiliano Berenbaum. Emiliano has spent his whole career working on enterprise products from database security solutions to network monitoring. He was the first non-founder employee at Okta and a key architect in pioneering cloud single sign-on in user management solutions. Emiliano was a co-founder and CTO of Sitel that was acquired by Hewlett-Packard Enterprise. He helped to develop the standards for SPIFFE and the CNF adopted standard for workload identity. Presently today, he's the CEO of Trussell that provides access control to critical cloud systems. Couldn't be happier to introduce Emiliano. How you doing, man?
How's it going, Chris? Great to be here with you.
Well, thanks so much. I think there's so much that people can learn from your story, and I love starting in the origin. And for you, when I go and you look at your LinkedIn, you see that you did a lot of work at a lot of different companies as an engineer before you really found yourself to this cloud identity access space. Help us understand a little bit of how did you find yourself in tech?
Yeah, so if we go to the beginning, when I was applying for college, right? This is in I guess I entered in 91, which was kind of an incredible time, right? It says, the web browsers and the internet, Mozilla was coming out and it was like this whole brand new thing. Right. And it was kind of in the cusp, right? I mean, we were still doing everything through terminals. And I was slightly into computers when I was young. I had my Commodore 64 and I did a little bit of programming, but, not to the level that I've known people, right? That they were like such savants, right? But I was applying and I got into an engineering program. I got into a program between NYU and a little college in New Jersey called Stevens. So it was a dual degree, right? I ended up doing electrical engineering and CS.
Wow.
But I had no idea, right? So I started getting into that and it clicked. A lot of the the stuff that we were learning, I really found my sweet spot. Right. I think a lot of people when they're kind of going into school and trying to figure out what they're going to study and do, it's hard for them to figure out like, hey, what really excites me? What do I like
Right.
learning about and doing? And I loved it. It was really great learning. I would go above and beyond what we have to do, right? And I never really thought of it as work in a way, which is kind of good,
Right.
right? You want to do something that you love. And something that really helped me is that when I got over, because I'd spent 3 years at NYU and then 2 years at Stevens in Hoboken, is that Stevens had a big co-op department,
Oh, wow.
and I decided to co-op, which ended up adding more time to my graduation. But it's funny because I ended up co-oping just at one place for my whole time, which was Belcor.
Hmm.
So I don't know if you know about Belcor, what that is, but a lot of people don't now, which is kind
Well,
of
I know about Bell Labs. Bell Labs at one point,
right.
I think the C programming language, I believe, came out of Bell Labs.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it was great because it was we had AT&T was broken up by the government and split into the baby bells, right? Like
Right.
I don't know people I don't know if people even know this anymore,
Remember
right?
that,
Unless you're a
right?
certain age. So you had like Bell Atlantic, Bell Pacific,
You had
uh,
Southern Bell.
Pac
I remember
Bell,
SBC.
Southern Bell, right? So all these companies they broke up into regionals, and AT&T got to keep the long distance business, and
Right.
then the seven baby bells got to keep you know
Local
the
landline.
local business, and
Yeah.
that's what Verizon became, right?
Hmm.
Verizon was New York, and I think they merged with Bell. You could kind of look at the history how the baby bells kind of
Then
went, but
remerged again into the two bigger. It's Verizon and AT&T now. Yeah.
yeah. So I was working at Bellcore, which was not only did they split the baby bells, they split Bell Labs, right? So
Mm.
there was Bell Labs that AT&T owned, and
Oh.
Bellcore was the R&D arm for the baby bells.
Oh,
And
interesting.
it was just an incredible place.
Wow.
It was just amazing to work there with, people that there was people there that were world famous, had invented so many things. We would always one of the one, I shouldn't say this, but one of the guys that was in the cafeteria, there was, I don't know if people know, there's this language called awk, right?
Right.
And it's basically the initials of the people that came up with that language. And one of the first ones, A, is Aho, and he wrote a compiler book. So we studied that in school. It was a
Right.
great thing, and I would see him in the cafeteria, and it was just crazy. But like just being like a little nerd fanboy about that kind of
Well,
stuff.
and it, yeah, and I think it gets overlooked today, but there was, I just remember Bell Labs, Bellcore,
Yeah,
Xerox
yeah,
Park was out west, but these were these epicenters. And when you think about the timeline that you were in, and you were in
yeah,
telecom in the
yeah.
90s, and you think about how everything is on mobile today, that was the birthplace. And
Oh yeah.
back then, I mean, it was computer science, wasn't all of these, applications and all this application level programming. I mean, you really had to sit at a layer that was between hardware, that was between software, that wasn't that mature at that point. So there was a lot of hard science back then.
Oh yeah. It was amazing, right? Because I shared an office with one of the folks that came up with oh god, I'm forgetting the standard. I don't think it was Sonnet, but one of the telephone standards. And
Mm.
what we were doing is that, see, it's kind of funny. It's all coming back to me. The way that it worked, the divestiture
Mm.
was that Bell Core could come up with the science, could come up with the standards and everything, but they couldn't manufacture
Oh, wow.
products and switches or anything like that. So,
Mm.
the group that I worked with was the group that came up with ISDN, which was kind of
Mm.
like the old the old technology that would go in, and it was like two wires. I forgot how many bits it was, but
Right.
what we were doing is we wrote software to test and make sure that the switches were compliant, right? So you would have these companies like Fujitsu
Mm.
and some of the German companies, American companies that would make the switches. We would get them in the lab and test them out. So I was writing software to look at the switches,
Mhm.
to basically talk to them and send them messages. And it was like this whole OID standard, right?
Wow.
Which kind of got adopted by SNMP, if you know that
Yeah,
stuff.
sure.
But just learning all of that, actually working with real stuff as I was, a junior and senior in college, I learned more like
Wow.
working there than I ever did, than I did in school. It was an amazing
Right,
experience,
right,
right?
right. That
So,
helped translate everything from this
oh
theoretical
yeah,
to now you're in there doing it. And I mean, I just also think that at that point in time, I mean, it was so new and it was the community was so small that you're right. You could just walk in a company like that, an experience like that, and just get knowledge dropped on you. That was amazing.
yeah, no, it was great. And everybody that worked there, it was like such an incredible experience because, they were all brilliant, all
Mm,
ready to teach. And I learned so much. It was just an incredible time. Right. And like I could go into it, a lot more, but I mean, I got into this language. We wrote a lot of the front end in this thing called TCL/TK, Tickle TK,
right.
which the gentleman who wrote it ended up going and working at Sun,
Oh
and
wow.
um, and I kind of followed it because I loved it. And then I started hearing about the other language that they were working on called Java, kind of
Right.
before it even hit. But it was just crazy, like just being part of that and seeing that. It was just an incredible time, and everything was happening so quickly back then. Even now, but it was incredible. But like you were saying, right, it was a lot of how do you go from the telco stuff now and into the world that we're in now, right? It was
Well,
pretty
yeah,
pretty fascinating.
because so now you're in this very cohesive environment where you're getting a lot of teaching, you're learning very rapidly. Then you exit and you start going out into
Yeah,
different businesses, and I'm sure at that point it had to be very different, right? You were probably walking in having a ton of experience with these guys, very new technology. I
yeah.
think trying to understand, like, how did you then start moving towards or moving forward as an engineer, and then falling into this whole position as architect?
Yeah, no, it was right after college, I went to work at IBM because I was in the East Coast
Yep.
and looking around at different jobs. I kind of have a funny story about that, where like looking at a lot of the banks and a lot of jobs in New York City was all banking,
Right.
right? That was before there were like any tech companies in New York. This is before the dot com,
Right.
right? So if you wanted to work in tech or programming or anything like that with computers, you were basically working at a bank,
Wow.
right? There was few software firms, like here and there, right? There were a couple, but not like it is now, right? There was
Right.
no Google or anything like that. And I talked to one of the banks, and I don't want to say who or anything, but they were asking me, the question was like, hey, what do you think what's your work environment like? And I started describing Belcor, right? I was like,
Right.
hey, look, it's this kind of collegiate environment. You could bounce ideas off each other. It's kind of pushing and all of this. And, you have luminaries, and you could learn and grow and understand the field and really capture that. And they had like a great library, and I would check out books and read it. And there were two of the guys were interviewing me, and then one of them turns to me and he said, well, I just want to tell you, at this company, we do real work. So I just, we don't do that stuff. I was like,
You're like, what? Real work?
what? That's what he told me. And I don't think I've ever been rejected from a job faster, because somehow I think like I had gotten home from the interview and they'd already called me and told me not to bother. Like they weren't going to keep on talking to me, but it was just funny, right? It was just, like seeing how these, a little bit between how it was East Coast, West Coast
Right.
philosophy, because I think Belcor was, even though they were in New Jersey, like when I look fondly back on those days, it had a little bit of a, you kind of see how a lot of these companies out here in California have become, because what you find out is a lot of the talent there ended up at Google and other places,
Mm,
which is really interesting, which is funny because I think when we talk about Spiffy and all that kind of stuff, it kind of connects back. So I
right.
love that, the how it loops back into Bell Labs.
Right. In your experience there.
Yep.
So then at what point in this transition did you start working in the security and access domain?
Oh, I not at that point, but it's funny because I did a couple of projects. So I was at IBM for a couple of years. Eventually, I did my .com stint. So
Mm,
I worked at a Latin American web portal
okay.
called Star Media. That was a while ago. So that was crazy, New York during the .coms. But the stuff that I worked on there was their email and the system that was kind of like their version of GeoCities, if you remember that one,
Right.
like where you could
Yeah.
publish your own web page.
Yeah.
Yeah, so just working on how to identify and how to like log into that, and it was crazy, right? It was the Wild West,
Right. There were
right?
no protocols.
Where
All the
nothing
frameworks we have today wasn't there. So I'm sure it was
nothing
just
existed. Yeah, yeah, because then it was we were kind of doing. It's funny because we would give people space to put. It was almost like a disk online, which is kind of crazy when you look at the Dropboxes and boxes of the world, right? We were
right.
giving people, I forgot how much space, right? At this point, because whatever number I say, it's going to sound so tiny, like, I don't know,
Right.
50 megs or something.
Right. Right.
And they could put up their little website and we would display it. But then, hackers would go in and create like bazillion accounts and then stripe content or wares across that and you could download. It was just, and we were trying to like take those accounts down, and it was like, how
Right.
were they authenticating, trying to put captchas and all of that. So it'd be kind of like, even back then, and this was like in the 90s, it
Right.
was like this warfare with people trying to exploit things and get in there
Mm,
and use our services for something else, right? So it
right.
was it
Yeah.
was pretty interesting, and I don't want to get more into it, but it was fascinating to see that at that point. Yeah,
As you're growing your career, you start
yeah,
identifying, okay, security, access. You also
right.
start moving from just being an engineer to being an architect. I'm curious, like what drew you? I mean, was it these experiences, like seeing the Wild West? Did you see, was it an opportunity that you saw, or was it really the fact that, no, I enjoy solving this problem. I enjoy trying to create this line of defense. And then what were,
Yeah,
additional like soft skills and things that you were building that helped you, position yourself from an engineer towards an architect?
yeah. I think an important thing is how do you bridge what's there to be able to explain it and put it
Mm,
together, and kind of explain, look, here's where we're trying to go, and here's the technology that we're trying to use to do that, um, with certain understanding, right? I think from as I look at things now, right,
right.
and back then, one of the problems is like your ego, that you think you could do everything, right? But important thing, a lesson from now is like, hey, look, I know up to here, right?
Right.
Here's where it ends. How do I get the right folks to work with me and kind of figure out
Mm,
the nitty gritty details? But the architecture role is kind of like sort of like the next step, right? Because you end up having something that's having persistent, that's talking to a database,
right.
right? So how do you start scaling this out? I think it also comes into what I would say, the difference between computer science and software engineering
Mm,
is it's kind of like an assembly line,
right.
right? Because like when you think about chemistry, right? It's like, hey, how do I combine these chemicals to do this, right? And chemical engineering is like, well, okay, well, how do I do this? How do I
Mm,
make a million pills
right.
or a million of this at scale, right? And
Mm,
then like all of a sudden I have to worry about heat and getting the materials there on time. So, it's the same thing with, I would say, computer engineering and product, right? Like, how do I push this out? How
mm,
does it scale? What's the methodology for reporting bugs or logging
right.
or performance and all these things? So,
Mm,
like understanding that and how those things have evolved has been amazing, right? And up to now, where we have, when I started, right, people would have point releases of products that were shrink wrapped and
right.
running in a computer, right?
Mm-hmm.
And now you kind of have, the model is SaaS where things are getting updated all the time.
Yep.
And, sometimes certain companies update all the time, anytime, right? But you have to build it in a way that you could do that. And comparing it to before, where it was like, well, we're going to big bang this every year or
You're
every
right. Yeah,
six
exactly.
months and
Send you a
deploy
new
something
disc.
is,
Yeah.
yeah, it's in your disk. Yeah, yeah. So understanding that and like all those mechanics, that's where you start getting into the
Mm.
architect part, right? To understand a lot of that stuff, right? And then you start moving beyond that. And I think that's where you start looking at companies and other parts that you could move into, right? As taking a higher role, right?
Oh,
Beyond the architect role.
wow. So that's I really like that analogy, and I want to just read that back because I think that makes complete sense in the sense in that computer science is this is the area, the arena that we're talking about. Engineering, software
Yep.
engineering is how do you now create these things at scale. And so
Yep.
for yourself, as you went in there, computer scientist working in lab, understanding a lot of things, you get fascinated by how do you build and scale these things. Also,
Yeah.
as industry is changing too, right? As we're moving from these smaller releases from on premise solutions, from client server, you're activating all these terminals to now you're actually living in the cloud.
Yeah.
Then your mind starts expanding as a engineer to becoming an architect and how this works together. And then I think what
Yep.
you slid in there right at the last minute is then you started thinking, well, how do companies work? How do I actually go and put companies together? And
Right.
this is on the career side, of this conversation that we're having today. I want to understand at what point did you start realizing? Because when I think about your career, you then get this architect position at Okta, and you grow and scale that company. Then ultimately you wind up at Splunk, helping us with our cloud solution in figuring out how do we make sure and secure that as we're scaling it. Then you say, I'm going to go start my own company. Like, what was going on? Like, what were you seeing, and what were the skills and confidence that you had to know that it was time to go do that? Or was it the subject
Yeah.
matter expertise? I think there's a little bit of both in there.
No, I mean, look, I think what starts happening is I did a couple of startups back in New York, in the East Coast, and that was really really eye opening, right? But then moved out to California, and by pure craziness, I got to meet Todd and Freddie, which were the two co-founders of Okta, and Todd had just left Salesforce and
Mm.
was starting Okta, which at that point it was called Sesure. Uh, but then the funny thing is, I forgot if it was his wife or somebody told him you should never have ass in a company name. Just that doesn't
Right.
work.
Don't, just take that out. That does shouldn't be there.
Yeah, take that out. And then eventually we landed with Okta, which was a pretty interesting story. But the great thing there was learning from those people, right? Learning
Mm,
from Todd and Freddie and everybody they hired, right? Because I wasn't really an architect. I was just working there, right? Like wearing a
right.
lot of different hats, but able to like pull in an amazing team, right?
Right.
Like really, really impressed by everybody that I worked with at Okta, and we were kind of building this together. And it was an interesting time, kind of a little bit similar like now, where it was like 2008. You'd had the market
Right.
crash,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of layoffs, right? A
Mm,
lot of people out on, looking around, and we built the whole company in San Francisco, right? So everybody
right.
was hired there, but just so many lessons, so much stuff learned there on what was going on, right? And it really kind of inspires you, right? And I think that's what ends up happening. Like you see certain companies or certain institutions where founders come out of,
Right.
and they almost become like petri dishes for this kind of stuff.
Mm,
So, there's a lot of people that started companies that came out of Salesforce,
true. Yes, very true.
right? And, out of Okta now, I've seen a lot of people that have come out of Okta that have started companies. And, for me being early on there with that team, you really see a lot of the different aspects, right? And I think if you kind of look at yourself, hey, I'm working at an IBM and I'm working at a fast growing startup, there is you kind of start seeing a lot of different parts of the industry that you never saw before,
Right.
right? Like, hey, I was never talking to customers, but all of a sudden, you're out there, you're developing the code, but you're also talking to customers and try to figure out requirements. Like, hey, what does this guy need? Like, what is it? What is the exact problem we're trying to solve for this
Mm,
person?
yes.
And then how do we do that in a quick way, right? Or
Yeah.
how do we do that but then iterate on it, right? I
Right.
mean, that's the important thing. But you start seeing that, right? You start seeing those different parts of it. And, when I think a big difference with Okta, one of the big things there was one of the early employees too was a gentleman called Brian Hansen, and he was a designer, right? And I'd never really worked with a designer before, right? And I think that's how, that was a big thing that Todd saw, right? I think that, seeing things like Facebook in 2008 and all
Right.
these
Yes.
things, a lot of times SaaS products or enterprise products were written by engineers for engineers. So it just looked like crap. It
Right.
was just like so hard to work with and so hard to figure out, like you'd see, and I even see that now, right? I'll see certain products and it's just so convoluted, right? And it's almost a model where you need a sales engineer to work with you and the deployment takes so long. But, one of the advantages that we had was, Brian was such a good UX UI person, like it made our product simple and easy to use and approachable, right? Because, now they're calling that PLG motion, product like growth,
Right.
but it
Yes.
really means like, can I, as an individual, go into your product, start setting it up, understanding, is there sufficient documentation? Am I self-reliant and I don't need, you know, um, somebody to hold my hand and put this all together, right? And I think that's critical, right? Which kind of like gets into one of my mantras, right? As I'm, to have my company now, like some of
Yeah.
the things that I believe, and taking that lesson, like one of the big things that I always tell everybody is like, hey, look, if you're working at Trussell, you're working here. Everybody here works on the product. There isn't anything here that isn't product. If your documentation sucks and nobody could figure out how your product works, your product sucks,
Right.
right? It doesn't matter if you're the most brilliant,
Mm,
computer scientist and you figured out the best algorithm, but if nobody could get to that or use it or
unlock the
or be
value of it.
there,
Yeah.
unlock the value, then it's worthless, right? And I think understanding that everybody there is contributing to the effort. Like if the documentation sucks, if the interfaces sucks, if I have to do like 50 clicks, is there an API that's simple to use,
Mm,
right? That's documented,
easy to
right?
connect to. Yeah.
Like that's the critical thing. And I think that's how your career starts to grow, right? When you kind of see that. Because if
Mm,
you're just like in a box writing code and you don't see this, a lot of times, I've always heard throughout my career, right, where people will say, the product manager will come in and say like, hey, it's not working. The person doesn't get it. And then, the engineers will be like, well, that guy's stupid. It's like, well,
yes.
no, It's not clear, right? We need good, concise error messages. We need to have a good explanation. What does this do? Do we have too many
Mm,
buttons? Should we have less buttons? Right? On top of everything else, right? And I think that's how you start kind of like to grow and see that, right? Like you're kind of, as you were saying, career path, you're starting out like writing, hey, I'm writing something that's talking to a Fujitsu switch that I'm using in a lab, right? And then eventually, you're coming in somewhere and you're like, hey, I'm writing this so you could connect to your users and we could kind of see usage and who's over entitled and how do I show all this information
mm,
in a nice, clean way. And then how do I export that data to Splunk so then you could alert on it, right?
right.
So that's something we're doing now. But
Well,
it's like understanding that path, right? How a lot of the stuff has morphed and changed.
well,
Yeah.
in what I heard you say that I think is so important for people to understand from a career perspective is it's we start off and we want to do our piece very well.
Yeah.
and and then it's understanding how do all of those pieces connect together, and sometimes it can be in you're doing a subroutine that's part of a larger piece of development, but ultimately what I heard you say is, and I don't know what the Trussell mantra is or your mantra is, but it's everybody is supporting the product, and if we
Yeah.
can't make the product clean and simple for our users, then we're not doing our job as a company. And that's one of the things that I talk about is we as tech employees have to be focused on ultimately the results that the company is trying to accomplish. We want to make
Right.
a piece of software or an application that's solving a specific problem. We want it easy to use, easy for people to understand. So you have to understand how everything is going to intersect and ultimately help that.
No, absolutely. Right. I think that when you kind of look at this, um, there's a certain experience. Let's say if you sit in a new car, right? Like,
Mm,
what's the smell when I open the door? How are the controls? What could I see, right? And people study this, the ergonomics of it, right? Like, where are the buttons, where are the switches, how do I interact with this stuff? How big are they? What do the lights look like? The colors, right? To make the best experience, right? So when you look at consumer products, people just study this all the time, right? But it's the same thing with enterprise software, right? And a lot of companies don't believe that. I've seen so many products that look like spreadsheets, and you're like, well, why don't I just use a spreadsheet? What do I have to use this,
that
right?
there's
So
a big question there, right? Yeah.
yeah, but you're right, right? But it's everything, right? And that's how you kind of like start growing. Is that, hey, look, the subroutine still needs to work,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like that's the thing, right? Like the function still needs to work. Like we need monitoring, we need logging, we need all of that. Like you need all the pieces, right? I mean, that's why it's hard to succeed, right? Because there's so
Mm,
many pieces to this, right? It's not, hey, do I have the right product? Is it going to be stable, right? What happens if I get a million users? Is this thing going to keel over, right? Has it
right.
been architected correctly? Does it scale? Also, is it easy to use? Is it documentation? And that's not even getting into sales and marketing, right? Which is in my role now, that's the part where you're like, oh, wait, I have to explain this to somebody in 3 sentences? Or how do I say what I do with 5 bullet points? Not
Mm,
only that it's valuable to you and compelling for you to have a conversation with me, but I'm also differentiating with the other 5 companies that are trying to do what we're doing or are similar and there's overlap, plus the 3 other companies that are, pretty big, but they're kind of missing this, but they kind of do this, but not perfectly. How do I tell that story? How do I make it compelling to you for you to pick up the phone or pick up the phone, get on a Zoom call with me
right.
and talk about it, and then like and me convey the value, right? So then we could kind of move on, and then move on to a demo, move on to a POC. Was my demo compelling enough? Did I answer all your questions? What's the POC process for you to try this out in your environment? And then how do we then get to a contract to negotiate that? Like all of those steps, right? As an engineer, right, being stuck, right? Let's say, like I'm back in New Jersey talking to a Fujitsu switch, right? Like that's the part that you end up realizing like, hey, look, if I can't sell this, if I can't sell this product or get people to use it, I don't have anything. Doesn't matter what I wrote.
Right?
And I think
Doesn't
that's what a lot of people miss, right? And they forget about.
and so then at what point? So I really enjoyed the Okta story. I think what I heard from you is that that was the moment where you saw the pieces come together. You saw everything happening, how it was done, and you'd obviously had other experiences. I think that things do change when people see it done right, or when they see it
Yeah.
work. When they see it finally work, you're like, oh, this is how it all comes together. And I
Yeah.
think it, and that's where I think success breeds success. You see,
Yeah.
Salesforce opened up. There was a lot of founders that came from Salesforce. Then now Okta saw success. People come from that company. So
Yep.
at some point, then I know you did go to Splunk. You got experience there. At some point,
Yeah.
though, you said, "I'm now ready to go found my own company." What was that
Yeah.
moment for you? Because you left security, you left a lot of, I'm sure, some RSUs and things on the table, but you
Yeah.
knew, and I'm trying to understand, was the drive really that you wanted to solve problem for customers? You saw a real opportunity in the market. Was it, I really want to build something on my own? Like what was the big driver and motivator for you?
Yeah. No, there's a lot of psychology, right? I think, there's ego, right?
Sure.
Like I'm smart. I know how to do this. I'll figure this out. Right. So you kind of like believe in yourself, which any person that wants to do this, like, I would say don't do it. Right. I mean, because it's like, you just hear the good stories,
Yeah.
right? Like everybody hears the successes. Everybody's like, well, I do this, I'm going to become a Google or something. Like those are
Mm,
those are like astronomical odds with incredibly small, like everything came together, right?
that's
It's
right.
just like a perfect thing, right? And you do a company and you get a couple of pivots and you could run out of cash,
Mm,
right? I think that's the big thing, right? Like what I mean, what made me want to do it is that I thought I could, right? I saw other people do it. And I think that's the funny thing about being in the valley, and you were here for a very long time, is you see it all the time,
that's right.
right? So I think that for people in other places that don't see it and don't see that kind of space or understand the industry of how do you raise money, how do people take a chance on you, they don't, they're not exposed to that, so they don't kind of think about that for software, right? And SaaS
Exactly.
things that we're talking about, right? I mean, people start businesses all the time, right? So there is that. Also, my father he was a shoe wholesaler. So
Mm,
I saw him in his business, right? I helped him out a lot. I would go with him to trade shows, and I kind of saw, I would travel to him to factories to source materials and things like that. So I kind of had that a little bit of my DNA also. And I want to try it out, right? I think that mentally and ego wise, you think like, hey, I could do this. I could try it out. But I had no idea what I was getting into, right? And all the details that go into it. But you're sort of, you think that I've built a better mousetrap, or we could figure this out. And here's a niche that we could kind of dive into, and we have a solution for it. And you're kind of playing out your thesis, right? So you're a builder, right? I think primarily you want to build things, and it's in a way I think of it as almost like I like Lego. I'm not embarrassed to say that I'm
sure.
nerdy in that sense, but like you end up trying to do harder and harder sets,
That's
right?
right.
So
Yep.
to me, it's like you're like, okay, I did this, I solved this problem. Now I solved this problem. Now here's a bigger problem, right? I want to build this. I want to understand this. Like you need to have a curiosity and a desire to
Mm.
to kind of go into it and understand it, because like you're taken out of your comfort zone,
Oh
right?
yeah,
Like as an engineer,
definitely.
if now my number one concern is sales and getting customers, right? Like that's it, right? Everything else comes out of that, but everything else has to work and be and be there. But it really is like, how do I tell my story, right? How am I a
Mm.
storyteller? And that's kind of like the eye-opening moment, right? That you kind of realize, like, what are the other facets that you have to do and understand, right?
And I really enjoy this because it seems like you're constantly learning, and you essentially keep moving in this engineering mindset of, now that I figured this out, how do I solve the next problem? How do I solve the next problem? And you have then this infusion of an entrepreneurial father who, you see
Yep.
him building and owning his own thing. You think, okay, I can do it. And I heard
Yep.
you say at one point you had the confidence, you knew you were ready, so you decided to do it. Is there, you also, though, I mean, coming out of Okta, and I know you had the access and security focus for our cloud product when we were at Splunk.
Yep.
Was there something like you were building this momentum inside of that space that said, I want to build in that? Or did you see problems to solve that you'd sort of been seeing all along from even, your early days? What helped you focus on that security space and access?
Yeah. No, definitely. I, people do go about this different ways, right? They're working on a problem internally,
Mm-hmm.
and they're like, hey, you know what, this is real, right? This is a tool that we're writing internally, but this could be a product, and I think we could build something around that, which is kind of like Trussell, right? Like that's what that is. I with Sitel, it it was kind of the growth of meshes and Kubernetes, that, as we kind of saw
Mm,
that, right? So Sitel, it was open source. We came up with a standard and an implementation of it, but it was kind of understanding, like, hey, um, the and it's funny because it is, in a way, it is security, and it's almost like the same when I think about it, right? Like, our thesis is, right, is like, there's no more firewall, right? Like, people are,
right.
you have no idea, right? So, Sitel is really like, how do I give this thing a piece of identity, right? And that being a certificate that's being rotated, and now I
Mm,
could have MTLS everywhere, right? Like,
right.
all traffic encrypted, right? And the interesting thing about that is, a lot of those theory, my co-founders were from Google, right? And internally for Google, they, there's something similar that they use.
Mm,
And the funny thing is, you start tracing the history of some of this technology. It came from some of the folks, and I hate that I'm forgetting the names, that had joined Google engineering and Google engineering leadership out of Bell Labs.
uh,
And there was an incident, and the way they were doing identity at that point was, and a lot of companies were doing identity, was like, hey, this port on this machine coming out of this switch,
mm-hmm,
right? Like, that's the database, and
right.
this is the application, right? But as they started getting more and more workloads in virtual environments, it just couldn't keep up.
Mm,
So they took something out of a project called Inferno, which was the next generation of Unix that they were building there.
wow.
And there was something called Plan 9. And you start looking at all the white papers, you're going back to like the 80s and 90s. And there was a project called Factotum, which I love that name. Also, um, so they took that and they kind of incorporated that into their systems, and we kind of borrow it from that. So it's kind of funny when you start tracing things back.
Right. The history of
Everyone's all
these
like, "Oh, this is
ideas.
brand new stuff." It's like, look, this thing has lineage going back to like New Jersey.
You want to keep
So
somebody
that,
out, you go to Jersey.
yeah, you go, yeah, you want a certificate? Talk to me.
Yeah. But
But yeah, that
so,
it, yeah,
well, so I was going to say, and so you had the Sitel experience, and then you decided to go do it again. Let's go back.
yeah.
What was, after you had your exit, what was then the decision that said, you know what, I'm Was it another idea? Was it the fact that you saw how you did it and you think, okay, now I can go do it again, get a better rep
Yeah.
repetition?
Yes. 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 Yes.
Mm,
I kind of saw. I was working with somebody helping out, and he was solving a problem, and I was like, you know what, this makes a lot of sense. This is I see this, right, and really what we're looking at is that, and it's funny because we've iterated on this so much, and we're going to keep on iterating on it, but a lot of companies, they don't realize how many people have access and to what,
that's true.
right?
Yes.
We're calling it an over entitlement tax that everybody's paying. But it's not only that you're paying an over entitlement tax because maybe you have more seats than you need, right? But
Right.
there's some companies that do cost efficiency, but for the people that we're talking about, and we call these folks citizen developers, right? Where it's not your DevOps, it's not your SecOps, it's also like your data engineers, your
Sure.
sales engineers,
That's right.
right? If you look at the access that they have into all these different applications, all these different SaaS apps that are holding your family jewels, they don't need it all the time.
Mm-mm.
So really the way we think about it is like there's this attack surface, right? Which is the access that people have,
Mm-hmm.
right? And if just doing some simple math, like if you're using this application or you have access to this application, let's say production, you're exposed at 8,700 hours a year, let's just say,
Wow.
right?
Yeah.
That's your exposure, right? And are you using that all the time? Right.
Mm.
And this isn't like your email or things like this. This
Right.
is
Right.
like
These are
critical things.
critical environments that,
Yeah.
if you're going to if you are a publicly traded company, some of those could be
Yep.
under compliance audits. I mean, that it's
Yep.
important stuff. Yep.
Yeah, then if you look at, I hate to say it, the MGM hack, right? Like first thing that happens is they pop, they're looking at LinkedIn, they're looking at, oh, like this guy is a senior infrastructure engineer. They pop his account, they make a lateral move to the IDP. This guy has access to everything in production. That's it. You're done,
Right.
right? Like that's what's happening, right? That's
Mm.
today, right? That's the active attack vector. And what we're doing is like, hey, let me show you who has that 8,700 hours. And hey, we could maybe put a multiplier on that with risk. If we calculate
Sure.
risk for you, it's bigger. What's his utilization rate? He's only used it 100 hours in the year, right? So he's over permissioned, right? And his
Mm.
utilization rate is like he's only using this, let's say, at 0.05%. Like, how do we make those numbers shorter?
Mm.
Right? Like, how do we start squeezing that so we could say,
Interesting.
hey, look, I mean, we could make it if we start putting your working hours, or like he's not using it when he's sleeping, right? But if he needs it, we could give it to him easily, right? So
Yeah.
that's a big thing that we've done, like that you could request access and you get it, and there's a whole workflow against it. And if you have permissioning or if you're on call, we take that all into account.
Mm-hmm.
But we want to make it simple because what ends up happening is in a lot of companies, when people request access, it takes a long time, right? And once somebody gets access, they never want to give it up, right?
They
So
don't.
like we'll go
Yeah.
in, yeah, we'll scan, and it's like, hey, this guy's not even here anymore. This person's a
Mm.
contractor, or is this a system? Is this a customer? Right. And access isn't, in a lot of these applications, you can't tell if that account is being used by another SaaS system that's pulling in data,
Sure.
or a customer that has to like access some data or push some files to you, or a contractor, right? Or an employee, right?
Mm.
So it's like this is kind of like the world and this is like the problem set and the world that I'm in right now, that, to me, it's fascinating. I think there's just so many ways to look at this and really, help people understand, give them the visibility so they could really understand, like, hey, for this, what is my risk exposure for this department or
Yes.
this job title or this team,
Mm-hmm.
right? And how do I help clean that up and manage that in a better way?
100%. Well, I want to take
Yep.
a quick break right here. I want to come back and I want to talk about, company acquisitions, startups a little bit more, but some of the
Yep.
strategies of how you built it so that you made sure that whatever type of exit you had, it was clean. So we'll be right back here in
Yep.
just a moment. We're back here. We're back here for part number 2, Emiliano Berenbaum. So we want to talk. It's so important. We believe, here, Tech Careers and Money Talk, you want to trade your time and talent for equity. And sometimes that's going to work for a corporate company, or sometimes it's building your own. And, you had the opportunity to exit your company for an acquisition. And I think it's so interesting, the strategies that are involved in that. How did you, like when you're building a startup company, how do you keep it clean and position it for whatever kind of exit that may be in front of you?
Yeah, no, I think that, and again, this is kind of like learning more, right? The
Right.
stuff that you never know about. And the critical part is to have that CFO or
Mm,
a fractional CFO. I'm super lucky. I work with a woman named Betty Caton. We've been working together now. It's crazy, like 6 years at this
wow.
point, which is nuts. But you need someone that understands the law, right? Like that's the hard part, right? Because like one of the things that you're going to see when you start getting into that executive role is like all the contracts, all the stuff that happens,
Wow. Yes.
and having that clean paperwork and it is vital, right? Do you have all the right signatures, right? Did everybody sign their offer letters, right?
Mm,
do we have like everyone's stock issuance? Is that all signed, right? Like little things like that. Like, are the contracts clean, right?
mm,
Like incorporation papers, like all of this stuff, right? Having somebody that understands that and could work with you is critical, right? Because if it's messed up, right, then you kind of have to go back and redo it, or sometimes you can't, right? Like I've seen situations where um, I don't want to say names or companies or anything, right? But usually, you know, you want to put, if you're hiring somebody, you want to put a cliff
right.
on their shares, right? Usually that's a standard deal, right? Like, hey, you have to work here for 10 for a year, and then you get a year,
Yeah.
and
You
then
get your
everything else is
25%.
vested per month.
Yeah.
Right. And that's usually how a lot of the contracts are, even for founders, right?
Mm,
Like I have that, right? But I've seen it where that wasn't in place and somebody leaves and the contract says like, hey, this guy's getting X% of the company. And you're like, well, what do we do now? Right. But
right.
it was not my experience, just like stuff
Right.
that I've seen. But that's the kind of stuff that, some folks don't think about, but it could sink a company before you even get started.
mm,
Right. And sometimes they have to like bankrupt and redo it and buy the assets on bankruptcy. It's crazy, right? It could get really, really messy. So having somebody that understands that process, and then when you're raising money, it even gets crazier, right? Like you're getting, it's sort of what's the joke, right? You if you're dealing with venture or anybody like that, they're doing how many of these deals have they done? They've done 100
right.
or 1,000 or whatever. How many have I done? One, right? So you need someone that's going to be able to translate that for you, because otherwise, you could sign stuff or not even realize what you're negotiating, right? So having somebody to help you with that is critical, right? Having that kind of a source that could help you do that is very important.
And so I mean, I think this is so important in many things that you're doing. Is you want to build the right team around you. So it sounds like
Yep.
getting on a clear footing when you're getting your startup off the ground, ensuring that you have
Yep.
somebody that can handle, finance and legal. And it sounded like your fractional CFO was overseeing the legal and could actually bring in resources to address that if necessary.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, it's great, right? Because like, what do I know, right? I know like
Sure.
code. I'm a code guy. It's like, oh, network traffic. I could look at packets, right? But it's like, wait a minute, how, did we structure this right? Does it have the right clauses, right? How do we, if we break the contract, how do we break the contract? What happens there, right? Like, what do we owe? How many days notice? How many days afterwards? Like all of this stuff. Like, like I've told people, right? Like sometimes I've had discussions and we go back and forth on a contract. I'm like, look, we want this to be the toughest discussion we have,
Mm,
right? Because if something happens, then and I don't want anything to happen. Look, it's written down, right? It's
right.
nothing like he said, she said, right? It's all written down. We understand each other and we're starting from a right footing,
That's
right?
right.
And I like to be crystal clear with people. And you don't want to like, um, you don't want to be straight with them. And it's just better to say, like, look, this is what it is. This is how this is how the contract work, or this is how our employment works. This is the equity you're going to receive. This is, and this is the
Break it
price and all of
down.
that stuff, right?
That's
Because
right.
I've seen people that are dishonest and liars, right? And whatever it is, I don't want someone to call me that, right? Like
Right.
I want to be straightforward and all of that, right? And the reason you're doing this is for the equity, right? If you're doing a startup, and which is funny, right? This is I shouldn't be saying this, right? That a lot of people are always I have this argument all the time, right? Especially being here where we are, right? Like you're raising this capital, it's precious, right? And you have people coming out of some big companies and we're like, well, I was making X at the company. Can you match that? And it's like, no, I can't. I cannot.
Right.
Right. What I could give you here is autonomy. You'll be able to build faster.
Mm,
There's no committees. We're moving fast. We're learning. You're going to do a lot of stuff and you're going to get this equity piece. But if you want X amount of dollars, stay where you are. We can't do that. Because, like, why would you go to a startup if you want the same money or more at an early stage?
the
Right.
same
It just doesn't
cash,
make
the
sense.
same cash, right? I mean, and that's, and oh, this is why we created this podcast, right? Is to be able to have this conversation because ultimately equity will be more valuable, is more scalable than the cash.
Yeah.
And that's the risk, right? You're taking the risk because there's more upside,
Yeah.
100%.
So have you talked about 83B elections and stuff like that in your podcast?
No, I'm actually looking to get a guest to talk about that, but I would love to. I mean, talk about 83B. Let's bring it up. I'm curious what the
And
context.
QSBS. Have you talked about QSBS
No,
also?
nope, not
Okay, well,
yet.
that's really the, like, 83B election. If your company offers it and you're joining a startup, that's the first question I would have if you have 83B election, which basically means that let's say I get 100 shares for a penny,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it's $1, right? Let's say it's $1. What you want to do is you want to buy those shares the second you go, the second you join the company or
Right.
whenever you can, because that starts the clock, right? Because the way options work is that you have to exercise them, and then you could sell them, right? But if you exercise, you have to hold it for a year for that to be long-term capital gains.
That's right.
So if you have, like we would get our RSUs, they would just take it away, right? But if you had options at a public company, the second they vest, right, the second you hit that 1 year cliff and you say, like, okay, I got 25% of my shares, I got 25 shares, right? You'd have to sell them that next day, right? You would have to, like, exercise them and sell them to cover the tax cost,
Right.
right? But with 83B election, you're able to do that now at a penny, let's say, because you're starting, if you go into a startup, the shares and options are worth very little, right? And it gets the clock ticking,
Well, it gets the
right?
clock
So
ticking, and then to your point, the fact that there's no spread between
there's no
the
spread,
strike
right?
price and then the fair market value of the company, that means that
Yep.
you're not going to be exposed to that additional tax,
Tax,
right?
right? Because let's say that penny goes to $1, right? You would have to, and you exercise at $1, you'd have to pay 90. You have to pay taxes on 99 cents,
Mm-hmm.
right, on that spread that you're
On the
talking
spread,
about. So I
right?
think understanding that is huge. And then QSBS is if you join before a company has a certain number of employees and a certain number um, of revenue, and you hold the shares for 5 years or more, then there's a federal exemption from those. It's not even taxed at long-term gains
Right.
up to, I think, $10 million, right? Which is a home run, right? Like if you're doing that, like
Yeah.
it's a huge thing. But it's like these little details that I talk to a lot of people, they just don't understand it. And it's like, what are you doing here? You're joining like an early stage company. You need to kind of understand the tax consequences of what you're getting into, right?
100%. Yep.
And then how to do that. And people say it's unfair, right? It's like, oh, that's not fair. But it's like, look, it's like, I don't know, 1 out of 10 of these work, right? That means that 90% of these are sold or everybody gets fired, right?
Right.
Plus, I'm taking, like what would my salary be on the open market, right? I bet you it's a lot more than I'm making now, I think,
Well, sure.
right?
100,
Like,
100%. I've seen those
right.
numbers.
So
Yes.
yeah, so everybody is taking a thing for a 10% chance or a 5% chance that you might hit it. So
Mm-hmm.
those are kind of the incentives that are put right now. I mean, that might change, right? But as of today, that's where we are with that stuff. So I think that understanding that and explaining it to the people that work for you, right? Like I always tell them, like, look, this is how this works, right? I mean, look, give me a check for $10, and that's what it is, right? It's not like that's not going to make, and then the thing is, if you leave before that, you get the money back, right?
Right.
Whatever you did invest.
Well,
Yeah.
and that's the thing is then there's also the opportunity, you put in a year or two, maybe you've already taken half off the table. Now you have that in the
Yeah.
bank. I think
You
that's
do.
really,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, because like part of the contracts too is like if you leave and you haven't invested or you haven't exercised any stocks, any options, sorry, I think there's usually a time limit and they go away.
That's right.
Right. So I think a lot of people don't understand that either, right? Like, or they
Mm-hmm.
don't read it. So they don't know that, like, hey, look, if I didn't exercise this, right, then and I leave, if I don't exercise by 90 days, it's just poof. It all goes back into the company coffers.
Goes
Right.
back into the pool. Yes. And I
Yeah.
definitely have seen that trend where many people want to go to work for equity, but they don't take the time to understand the nuance of it or what it
Yeah.
means because it's an asset in and of itself that has nuance and understanding depending on when you join the
Absolutely.
company.
Yeah. If you're doing like something with a tax expert on 83B elections and stuff like that, especially when you get outside, and I hate to, when you get outside the Bay Area, a lot of people just don't even. I'm always surprised, right, when I bring these things up, and they're like, "What is
Well,
that? I don't
and
get it.
I was
Why?"
even in the Bay Area, right? And I would, same thing is I was very, very big on educating people on what the stock was, what it meant. Because sometimes there'd be people who came from consulting or other
Yep.
companies where they had maybe employee share purchase programs, but they'd never gotten
Right.
RSUs or they'd never gotten ISOs. And so
Right.
you got to, break down and explain to them what it is.
Right. And those are different than company shares. I mean, than company options that you're getting at a startup, right?
Right. I
And
mean,
yeah.
it's a whole gambit. Yeah. But that's a great
Right.
idea.
And
I do have some great tax guys that we covered some of this stuff before, but they're
yeah.
phenomenal. That'd be a great episode. So thanks for that idea.
Yeah. And not even get into preferred shares and stuff like that, right? Which is what the VCs get, right?
Right.
So there's a whole like stack of preference and all the crazy laws, and that's, as a founder, that's the kind of stuff that you need to understand, right?
Mm.
Plus the code has to work, right? So that's
Well,
the
yeah, the
that's the
code
hard
has,
thing.
I mean, but this is it's the two sides of it, right? Is like you're
Yeah.
building the business because again, you want the equity, you want to be able to
Right.
get to the point where you can realize those things. So you have to understand that. And it's not an or, right? If you're
Yeah.
doing it right.
Yeah. And the other thing is I try to be, and I don't know. I don't know how other founders do it or what they do. And maybe I'm doing it wrong, but I am super transparent, right? And I tell everybody like, look, this is what we're doing. If we get here, if we get to this point that it's a wash, right? It's
Yeah.
not, these things are worth nothing,
Right.
right? And we took it, but that's why you're here, right? Can this thing go up to a certain point, right? Can the
Mm-hmm.
can the equity be worth X, right? And X is 100 times a penny or whatever it is.
Right.
right? Or 1,000 times, or is it, or am I learning too, right? A lot of
That's right.
people, like, what I always tell people is, look, it's careers come and go, right? Companies come and go, right? There's
Mm-hmm.
people that, like you and I, work together,
Yeah.
right? And we're still connected. And I talk to a lot of people that have worked with me or for me, and some people don't want to talk to me, some do,
Yeah.
right? But it's really, it's critical that um, you educate people and they kind of get exposed to this, because it's like, what I say to them is like, look, this is you on day one,
Mm,
right? When you leave Trussell, are you going to be better? Are you going to
right.
be more informed? Are you going to be like more worldly? Are you going to see like, hey, look, this is how we sell to the customers. This is how we talk at conferences. This is how I present this, right? Like, what exposure could I
Mm,
give people? And it's funny because one of the proudest things that I have about my last company, Sitel, I mean, we were small, right? We weren't even 20 people.
mm.
Uh, there's already two companies being formed from the alumni,
Wow.
right? That they've started their own companies. And it's amazing. I love that,
That's great.
right? Yeah, because you kind
Beautiful
of want to
story.
see that, right? I mean, because it's how you build these networks of people, and that's a critical part too, right? I think and it's like those soft skills that you have, right?
Well, it is, and then it's. I just love seeing. I just know for myself, I remember at a point in my career where I was helping people get to a director level, and I love seeing
Yeah,
them get to a director level. And while I went and was a chief information officer for a moment in my career, there's people that are now I help get to director level that are now VPs, chief information officers, and are running and doing impactful things at larger companies. And it's it's the fact that you're right. You're running an organization for a moment in time that's educating and skilling people up so that they can realize their true potential, so that they can
yeah,
actually do things and make more of an impact in this world of technology that we're in.
yeah. And I think, and it's funny because I think I know some of the people you're talking about
Yeah,
that
you do.
also, and they're doing great. And it's yeah, it's sort of like, what is your role, right? You're part mentor. You're trying to like grow people. You're trying to like give back, right?
Mm-hmm.
I had people through my career that helped me. I remember like sitting in the office of the guy, the gentleman that ran the department at Belcor.
Mm-hmm.
And I only met him like once or twice, and his name was um, Stuart Pasonic, I think was his name, right? But he told me, like, look, the tech's always changing. It is always
Mm,
moving, and you want to be in the vanguard. You want to be the tip of the spear, because like 2-3 years, the stuff will leave you behind,
right.
right? If you're not growing with it and moving with it with your career, you're going to be left behind. And
Mm,
seriously, for a 22-year-old me, that was great advice, right? And I've always tried to be on the vanguard, right? Because this stuff moves fast, right?
oh.
Ironically, I think now if you're a COBOL programmer, you're probably making a killing because nobody knows that anymore. But
The two that are left. Yeah.
yeah, the two that, yeah,
So I do want to try and wrap up on this side. Like, just talk a little
yeah,
bit more of, you obviously went through an acquisition before. What are some
yeah,
strategies or tips? Like, if as we talk about, you obviously had to prepare the team, you had to prepare the
right.
company for acquisition. What are just a couple of strategies and tips that you would give to other founders, other employees, around that process?
You got to take care of people, right? I think that's a big thing. You got to make sure that depends what the circumstances are for the acquisition, but I think first and foremost, right? Like, am I taking care of my folks,
Mm-hmm.
right? Are they gonna, when they leave and they're done, are they gonna be like, Emiliano was a jerk, he screwed me over,
Right.
right? Or like, look, we did the best with what we had, and I landed somewhere, and then we kind of went from there, and I did XYZ, right? and again, I don't know. Maybe I'm stupid, right? I'm trying to be a nice. Maybe I'm too nice, or I'm being naive, or I'm trying to make sure that the folks are being taken care of and the team is good because the world is small. It's a small
Very, very
world,
small world.
right? Like, especially in tech. Like, I think people don't realize that. Like, I think that's a big advice. That's a big thing. Like, don't burn bridges. Don't be that jerk because with LinkedIn, everybody knows somebody that knows that person,
It's true.
and everybody's back channeling, everyone's asking. I want people to say, that I treated them right. Right. And I think that's one big thing, a big thing on the legal end. You got to make, like I said, going back to the beginning, you got to make sure everything is super tight on the legal
Mm,
end, right? Do I have all my signatures? Is everything there? Right. And, sometimes what happens is when the acquirer comes in, they come in and they look at your employment contracts and they're like, well, we want to change XYZ, right?
oh, wow.
Um, and that happens, right? I mean, it could go either way, right? I mean, it depends what it is. I mean, I'm just
Yeah. Yeah.
from
Being
what I've heard
transparent.
from
Yeah.
people,
Yeah.
and you got to go back and sell it to your team,
Mm,
and then you got to tell them like, hey, look, we got to do this, right? They want us to come in and do this, and what's it gonna like? Just to make sure. So that's a big reason you want to take care of them,
right.
right? Because you'll have key players, and what ends up happening is like we got to make sure the key players come along, right? Because otherwise, what are
Mm,
we buying? It also depends how big the company is at that point. We were small when we were
right.
acquired, but I think if it's bigger, it's definitely a different set of questions, right? That you'd ask at that point, like your sales list and all that kind of stuff, and your
Mm,
customers and how they're going to transition and all of that, right? But that's also what you're selling, right? Like what's my revenue stream? What are the folks that I have? What are my deals? My deal size? Like a lot of that is, um,
mm.
critical. I mean, I can't even imagine the Splunk deal that just happened with
Right.
Cisco.
Right.
That would,
I was mind boggled too. Like there's a whole team of people that are managing
yeah,
that
the
are that.
legal bill there. I would love to see that. I mean, that's going to be, I think that's going to be over seven figures in fees, I'm sure.
Oh, easily, if not eight.
Yeah. Yeah. That's going to be, just dealing with what we did for
Oh,
our little company. I just can't even imagine like
yeah,
that stuff.
it's crazy.
Yeah. Yeah. But I mean, that's a critical thing, right? Like having good hygiene on your paperwork and all your contracts, it's super critical,
It sounds like
right? Even
it's
when you're
foundational. Yeah.
raising money, that's what they want to see, your books, right? And if your
Mm,
books look like crap, then it's not a good sign.
not at all.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I want to thank you for the time today. We always wrap up with a fire round of 5 questions. And so,
Okay.
number one is, what's the worst career advice you ever received?
What's the worst career advice that I ever received? I think it was from myself, right? I think that
That can
I've
happen.
learned this the hard way. I think the worst career advice that I received was when I left certain companies when I shouldn't have, right?
Mm,
Because of my ego and me not being able to play well with others, right? So
yeah.
I've made that mistake, right? I've left places a little bit too early, and I shouldn't have left, and I should have stuck it out a little bit more, right? So I think that's you kind of have to, like, if you're going to exit a company, you want to do it on your own terms at the right time,
Yes.
and don't let your emotions get the best of you.
Get
And
the better of you.
I've made that mistake. So that was me. I'm and it's funny because I've given people that same advice. Well, I was like, don't leave. You got to wait, see that
Yeah.
everything's right. I know you don't like it, but wait for the situation, or there's a vesting period coming, and
Right.
with options, you want to hit a certain cliff. So wait for that. Right.
That's right.
So
Patience and being, because sometimes it's the waiting, as hard as it is, it's going to realize all of the value of the time that you've already put in. I mean, we are
right.
playing. This is a different game here. This is the equity game, and it's all about making
Yeah,
sure
that's the game you're playing. If that's the game you're playing.
if that is
Yeah, definitely.
100%.
Yeah. Yeah.
How do you keep learning?
Um, I keep learning. Reading, definitely trying to keep up on things. I definitely have a couple of Google queries that come and send me articles on certain topics that I want to see.
Mm,
Um, I'm not on every board. I know some people like stay up on that pretty on some of the
right.
security boards, but definitely trying to reading the trends, right? I mean, there's so much happening, right?
Oh,
So much,
volume is
right?
amazing. Yeah.
But kind of being in the open source world for a while, it's kind of understanding what are the big projects coming up and how people are solving things. Because another one of my mantras is don't do meta work, right? Where I've
Mm,
seen like people are like, hey, we want to write our own database. It's like, why would you want to do that? Just grab one off the shelf.
yeah.
And for a lot of stuff like that, there's something already that solves your problem. Like, let's look into that, and that research and understanding. I think that's critical.
Important to, right, to understand like where are there some good steady solutions out there that you don't have to
Yeah,
go reinvent
and
the
talking
wheel.
to people too.
Yeah.
That's a big thing, right? Reaching
Mm,
out when you don't know. That's a way to like keep educated too.
huge, huge.
Yeah.
What do you do to recharge?
To recharge, I'll take time to go to the gym, and it's kind of like a way for me to zen out. Right. I feel that I used to do yoga,
Yeah.
but I think it's important to do something physical where you're not thinking and you're kind of detaching your mind. I know that sounds very new agey coming from a guy that grew up in Long Island, but
Right.
I think it's important to kind of take yourself out of the moment
Mm.
and then go back into it. I don't do meditation, but I'm willing to try.
Hey, open your mind. You never
Yeah.
know.
Hey,
Um,
you never know what's going to get in there.
what's the advice you'd give your younger self working in tech?
Um, what's the advice? Well, buy more Apple shares and don't sell them when they doubled. That would have been my advice. And keep on to the Microsoft shares and never sell them. That's the advice I would give myself.
That's the advice you'd give your younger self. That's great
Yeah, my
advice.
younger self. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's the best advice I would give. And yeah, yeah, yeah. Don't sell it like the month after Steve Jobs comes back. Just hold on to it.
Just
It's
hold
going to
on
be
just a
okay.
little bit more. Yeah.
Just a little bit longer. Yes.
What soft skill do you think has helped your career the most?
I think you kind of have to. I think listening,
Mm,
right? And I think that's something that I try to work on all the time, right? So I want to give people like I think one big thing, and if I mess this up, I'm sorry to the people I work with, but you could be you're wrong a lot of times, right? And you're
right.
kind of like if you're this, what is it like if you're there's a couple of sayings, right? Like one of them is like, if you're the smartest person in the room, go to another room, right? And I people that work with me, like they're better at a lot of stuff, right? So I want to understand, like, hey, look, this is how we want to go about this. What do you think?
Mm,
Why do you think this is a bad idea, right? And then we kind of go back and forth, and just giving people space and respect for their
right.
opinion and what we need to do, right? I think that's critical because a lot of times in my career, right, and as I've gotten up the ladder, right, like it's funny. Like I worked at one company where I hired a lot of co-ops,
Mm,
and I still talk to those folks. Right? It's crazy, right? Like 20 years later, there's a couple of people that I still talk to. They had amazing ideas,
right.
right? And great insights, and you're learning from everyone and those
Mm,
people. And I think listening and learning and just trying to give people make them comfortable that you're approachable and you could talk to, right? Because if you're a jerk and nobody wants to talk to you, it's just I don't know. That's not my vibe.
well, I just think, yeah, that doesn't align with your values. And at some point, yeah, I think, yeah, it's going to be hard for them to scale, to be honest. Yeah.
Yeah. Right, because you want to scale, right? It's just like I can't do all of this, right? I want to be surrounded by people that could help me, not hold them back, right?
100%. Well, Emiliano, that's it for us. I can't thank you so much
All
for your
right.
time. I'll make sure that people can find out about Trustful down below. I'll put the website, the link in there. But thanks for your time, man. Thanks for joining us today on this interview with Emiliano Berenbaum around building and growing your career from a developer to an architect to a CEO And then also having your companies be acquired and building equity and not just trading your time and talent for it. I think there was a few takeaways that I just want to tease out. It's obvious to me that Emiliano was able to develop his skills. He had deep technical skills that he got working for Bell Corp. And then he was able to translate that into a specialization around security that he's still leveraging today. You can also hear in his story how he continued to look for different opportunities to solve bigger problems that led him to that developer, to the architect, to the chief technology officer of his previous company, and now the CEO of this one. Always looking to solve bigger problems led him to solving problems that created larger impact. I think from the other side, when it talks about building equity, you heard very clearly how important it is to make sure that you get your paperwork straight, that you have somebody that can complement your skills that you're trying to build, that you're leaning into, as he was, from understanding product development, sales. He wanted somebody that could help him drive the paperwork, the details, the nuance, so that he could focus on what was most important for him. I hope you enjoyed that episode. I would ask you one thing. If you're enjoying Tech Careers and Money Talk, please leave us a review. We do need reviews to let other people know how well we're doing. Helps the podcast tremendously. Please let us know what you think and leave us a review. Thank you very much. See you on the next episode.